I'm staring down the barrel of consequences, quite literally, as Marco the Reaper Valentino's ice blue eyes bore into mine with the kind of intensity that's made grown men weep, beg, and probably sign over their souls with a shaky hand, and the desperate hope that mercy might find them in their final moments. But here's the thing about me. The thing that's gotten me into more trouble than I can count on both hands, and possibly a few toes. I've never been good at reading the room, at understanding when I should shut my mouth and lower my eyes and play the part of the apologetic, trembling woman who knows her place in the grand hierarchy of Chicago's underworld. And I'm definitely not starting now. Not when I'm running on 4 hours of sleep, 3 cups of gas station coffee, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that makes you feel invincible in the most dangerous way possible. So, I say, and I can hear my own voice cutting through the suffocating silence that's fallen over Castello Nero, like a velvet curtain dropped too quickly, wiping red wine off my apron with the kind of casual indifference that would make my mother, God rest her chaotic soul, either proud or horrified, probably both simultaneously. Are we going to stand here all night having a staring contest? Or are you going to let me finish my shift so I can get to my other job before my manager decides I'm more trouble than I'm worth? The entire restaurant has gone so silent that I can hear the kitchen staff holding their collective breath somewhere behind the swinging doors. Can feel my coworker Jenny's panic radiating from across the room in waves so thick I could probably swim through them if I had the energy or the inclination to care. But instead I just cock my hip to the side in a posture that's pure defiance wrapped in minimum wage confidence and raise an eyebrow at the most dangerous man in Chicago, possibly the entire Midwest if the rumors are even halfway true. Big mistake? Probably, almost certainly, the kind of monumental error in judgment that future versions of myself will look back on and wonder what the hell I was thinking in this precise moment. Do I care? Ask me when I'm not running on empty, when my feet don't feel like they're going to fall off from pulling a double shift, when the memory of my mother's medical bills isn't sitting in my studio apartment like a ghost that demands monthly payments to stay quiet, when I haven't spent the last 24 years of my life learning that sometimes the only way to survive is to pretend you're not afraid, even when terror is crawling up your spine like ice-cold fingers. Let me back up. Give you the context that led to this monumentally stupid moment. This snapshot in time where my entire life is about to pivot on an axis I didn't even know existed until approximately 4 minutes ago. My name is Sarah Winters, and I'm a waitress at Castello Nero, which is what happens when someone decides to combine old-world Italian, elegance with new money opulence and a healthy dose of mob aesthetics that probably aren't even trying to be subtle anymore. The restaurant sits in Chicago's Gold Coast like a beautiful, expensive warning. All marble columns and crystal chandeliers, and the kind of atmosphere that screams, "We have money and we're not afraid to show it. Also, please don't ask where it came from." I've been working here for 8 months, ever since my mother died, and left me with a mountain of debt that's currently pursuing a PhD in making my life miserable. And in those 8 months, I've learned to navigate the peculiar ecosystem of Castello Nero with the skill of someone who desperately needs the tips and can't afford to ask too many questions about why certain tables get special treatment or why some conversations stop abruptly when I approach with water refills. Tonight started like any other Friday shift, which means chaos orchestrated into something resembling order, a full house of Chicago's elite who've come to see and be seen while eating overpriced pasta and pretending they don't know exactly what kind of establishment they're patronizing. I was working my section near the back, the tables that aren't quite prestigious enough for the real power players, but still command enough respect that the tips make my student loans slightly less soul-crushing, when Table 12 decided to become a problem in the way that men with too much money and not enough supervision often do. The guy, mid-40s, expensive suit that couldn't hide the softness around his middle, wedding ring that he kept turning nervously like it was burning his finger, had been getting progressively handsy throughout the evening, each drink making him bolder, each rebuff from me making him more insistent in that particular way that men like him never seem to understand means no. When he grabbed my wrist during dessert service, his fingers wrapping around my skin with a possessiveness that made my stomach turn, and my vision narrow into that dangerous tunnel that appears when someone crosses a line they shouldn't even know exists. I did what I've always done when backed into a corner by men who think women in service positions are part of the amenities. I yanked my arm back with enough force to make my point crystal clear, to establish that I'm not now, nor will I ever be something that can be grabbed or claimed or treated like property. Unfortunately, physics and momentum decided to join forces with my righteous anger in the worst possible way, because my elbow connected with the wine bottle I'd been about to pour from, a 1947 Chateau Cheval Blanc that cost more than my car, my rent, and probably my entire existence combined. And I could only watch in that slow-motion horror that accompanies true disasters as the bottle tipped, tumbled, and proceeded to empty its $15,000 contents all over the man sitting at the table directly beside us. Not just any man, of course, because the universe has a sense of humor darker than midnight in a cave, but Marco Valentino himself, who I'd only ever seen from a distance, always surrounded by his people, always radiating the kind of danger that makes smart people cross the street and smarter people leave the neighborhood entirely. He'd been sitting there in his three-piece Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, deep in conversation with three other men who all had that same sharp-eyed alertness that marks them as predators rather than prey. And now he was absolutely drenched in red wine that looked disturbingly like blood against the pristine white of his shirt, dripping down his face and his perfectly tailored jacket and pooling on the floor like evidence at a crime scene. The restaurant had gone silent in that way that feels like the world holding its breath before something terrible happens. That moment of collective inhalation before the explosion. And I'd watched as Marco Valentino slowly, deliberately, with the kind of controlled movement that's somehow more frightening than violence, wiped wine from his face with a cloth napkin that one of his men had thrust into his hand. He hadn't yelled, hadn't made a scene, hadn't done any of the things that normal people do when covered in expensive wine, but instead he'd simply stood up, all 6'3" of controlled menace unfolding from his chair like a dark promise, and turned those ice-blue eyes on me with an expression that I couldn't quite read, but knew instinctively meant trouble of the permanent kind. His enforcer, a mountain of a man named Luca, who looks like he eats regular men for breakfast and saves the bones for appetizers, had taken one look at the situation, and then at me. And I'd seen his hand move toward his jacket in a way that probably meant something very bad for my continued existence on this planet. "Boss," he'd said, his voice carrying that particular tone of deference mixed with barely contained violence. "I think this little waitress needs to learn some respect. Maybe apologize properly on her knees before we decide what to do with her." And that's when my mouth, that beautiful, terrible instrument of my own destruction, had opened before my brain could send the urgent memo that maybe, just maybe, this was the time to be quiet and apologetic and everything I'm fundamentally not wired to be. I'd laughed, not a nervous giggle but a genuine bark of humor that surprised even me, because there's something absurd about the whole situation, about the fact that defending myself from one grabby customer had led to me potentially becoming a cautionary tale. And I'd looked Luca dead in his cold, calculating eyes, and said the words that I knew even as they left my mouth were going to change everything, were going to draw a line in my life between before and after, between safe and sorry, between the woman I was and whoever I was about to become. "Man, don't dare me," I'd said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline singing through my veins like electricity, despite the very real possibility that I was about to become another Chicago tragedy that people whisper about in hushed tones. I've had worse threats from my landlord, and at least he has the decency to text them instead of posturing like some kind of discount movie villain. The reaction had been immediate and varied. Luca's face had gone from threatening to shocked to absolutely murderous in the space of a heartbeat. Jenny had made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a prayer. And somewhere in the kitchen, I'm pretty sure someone dropped an entire tray of dishes. But Marco Valentino, the Reaper himself, The man who supposedly once made an entire rival family disappear over a territorial dispute had gone absolutely, terrifyingly still. He'd studied me with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through skin and bone to whatever lay beneath, his head tilting slightly to the side like I was a puzzle he'd never encountered before, an anomaly in his carefully ordered world of fear and respect and absolute obedience. And I'd seen something flicker across his face that might have been surprise, or might have been interest, or might have been the moment he decided exactly how he was going to kill me. "You're not afraid," he'd said finally. And it wasn't a question, but rather an observation delivered in a voice like expensive whiskey, smooth and dangerous and liable to make you do things you'd regret in the morning. Why is that, I wonder? Why does a waitress who just cost me $15,000 and a very expensive suit look me in the eyes like she has every right to be standing there instead of running for her life? And I'd opened my mouth to respond, to say something clever or cutting, or at least something that might extend my life expectancy past the next 5 minutes, when Jenny had materialized at my elbow like a guardian angel who'd shown up way too late to actually prevent the disaster, but was still determined to minimize the damage. "Mr. Valentino, sir," she'd said, her voice shaking like autumn leaves in a strong wind. "Sarah didn't mean any disrespect. She was just defending herself from that man at table 12 who's been harassing her all evening. She's a good waitress, the best we have, and I'm sure we can work something out to compensate you for the wine and the suit, and please don't hurt her because she's literally the only person who covers my shifts when my daughter is sick." And I'd wanted to tell Jenny to stop talking, to stop drawing attention to herself, to not put herself in the crosshairs of whatever this situation was becoming. But Marco's attention had already shifted slightly, his eyes moving to table 12 where the handsy customer had gone absolutely pale and was starting to push back his chair, like he was considering making a run for it. "Is this true?" Marco had asked me, his voice still carrying that dangerous smoothness that somehow made every word feel like it had weight and consequence. "Was this man touching you without permission?" And I'd nodded, because lying to someone like Marco Valentino seemed like an even worse idea than insulting his enforcer, seemed like the kind of mistake that people don't usually survive to regret. Something had shifted in his expression then, something dark and possessive and absolutely terrifying, and he'd turned to Luca with instructions delivered in rapid Italian that I couldn't follow, but that made the handsy customer from table 12 suddenly very, very eager to leave, scrambling out of his seat and practically running for the exit, while Luca followed with the casual gait of a predator who knows his prey isn't going anywhere it can't be found. Then Marco's attention had returned to me, full force and completely undivided, and he'd stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody with notes of bergamot that probably cost more per ounce than I made in a week, mixed with the red wine that was still dripping from his hair onto his ruined shirt. "You have 2 choices," he'd said, his voice dropping to something that felt intimate, despite the audience of his remaining men and the entire restaurant staff who were watching this play out like it was dinner theater of the most dangerous kind. "You can work off the debt of that wine as my personal waitress at my private estate until I decide you've paid your dues, or I can make a few phone calls and ensure you never work in this city again, that every restaurant, every bar, every establishment that might hire someone with your particular brand of defiant stupidity knows exactly who you are and what happens to people who disrespect me." It wasn't really a choice, not in any meaningful sense of the word, and we both knew it. But I appreciated that he'd at least framed it as an option, had given me the illusion of agency in a situation where I had absolutely none. I should have been terrified, should have been on my knees begging for mercy or calling for help, or doing literally anything other than what I did, which was to look Marco Valentino dead in his cold, beautiful eyes and say, "Fine, I'll take the job, but I'm not calling you sir, and I'm definitely not getting on my knees for anyone. So if that's a requirement of this arrangement, then you'd better make those phone calls now and save us both the trouble." I'd watched something flicker in his eyes then, something that might have been respect or amusement or the first spark of an obsession that neither of us understood yet, and he'd nodded once, A sharp, decisive movement that felt like a contract being signed in blood and wine, and words that couldn't be taken back. "Rosa will give you the address and the details," he'd said, already turning away like I was dismissed, like he'd already moved on to more important matters than one stubborn waitress who'd just agreed to walk directly into the lion's den. "You start Monday morning at 6 a.m. sharp? And Sarah?" He'd paused, looking back over his shoulder with an expression that made my heart do something complicated in my chest, something that felt like fear and anticipation tangled together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Don't be late, because I hate waiting, and you've already used up your quota of my patience for the next decade." And with that, he'd walked out of Castello Nero with his remaining men forming a protective barrier around him, leaving me standing in a puddle of $15,000 wine, holding a wine-stained apron, and wondering what the hell I'd just agreed to. What kind of devil's bargain I'd just made with a man who probably had more blood on his hands than a slaughterhouse, and definitely had the power to make me disappear without a trace. Jenny had grabbed my arm the moment they were gone, her fingers digging into my skin hard enough to bruise, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief that probably mirrored my own internal state. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" she'd hissed, pulling me toward the kitchen and away from the remaining diners who were starting to whisper among themselves, already turning this into a story they'd tell at cocktail parties. "Do you have any idea who Marco Valentino is? What he's capable of? What happens to people who cross him or insult him or even look at him wrong on a bad day?" And I'd wanted to tell her that no, I didn't really know, that I'd just been reacting on instinct and exhaustion and the particular brand of stupidity that comes from being so tired of being afraid that you stop caring about consequences. But before I could respond, Rosa, the head hostess who'd been working at Castello Nero longer than anyone could remember, had appeared with a piece of paper that had an address in Lake Forest written in elegant script, and a time that made me want to weep because it meant I'd be getting maybe 3 hours of sleep if I was lucky. "He never makes this offer," Rosa had said quietly, her eyes searching my face like she was looking for something specific, some quality or characteristic that explained why Marco Valentino had decided to keep me alive instead of making me another cautionary tale. "Never brings outsiders to the estate, never gives second chances, never shows mercy to people who disrespect him in public like you just did. So either you're the luckiest woman in Chicago or the most doomed, and I genuinely cannot tell which." She'd pressed the paper into my hand with a grip that felt like both a lifeline and a warning. "Be careful, little one, because men like Marco Valentino don't let go of things they've decided they want. And he just decided he wants something from you, even if neither of you knows what that something is yet." Now I'm standing in my tiny studio apartment at 3 in the morning, staring at the address that's going to change my life, wondering if I should run, if I should pack my few belongings and leave Chicago entirely, start over somewhere else where the Mafia doesn't know my name, and I haven't just painted a target on my back by being too tired and too stubborn to be appropriately afraid. But I know I won't run. Know that I can't afford to. Not when I still have my mother's debts hanging over my head like a guillotine blade. Not when starting over means giving up on medical school and the dreams that kept me going through her long dying. Not when some part of me, the part that's always been more curious than cautious, more reckless than reasonable, wants to know what happens next. Wants to see what kind of man Marco Valentino really is behind those ice blue eyes and that reputation for violence. So instead of packing, I set my alarm for 5 a.m., knowing that Monday morning is going to come whether I'm ready for it or not. And as I finally drift off into an uneasy sleep, my last thought is a question that I won't be able to answer until I walk through those estate gates. Did I just save myself? Or did I just agree to my own destruction at the hands of Chicago's most dangerous man? The Valentino estate isn't just a house. It's a fortress wrapped in marble and malice. And I'm pretty sure I just signed my death warrant by showing up here in my beat-up Honda Civic that makes concerning grinding noises whenever I try to accelerate past 40 miles per hour. The kind of sounds that suggest my car is held together by prayers and the sheer force of my denial about its inevitable demise. The gate alone probably costs more than my entire existence. All wrought iron worked into intricate patterns that look beautiful, until you notice the cameras positioned at strategic intervals, and the very subtle but definitely present armed guards who are watching my approach with the kind of attention that makes it clear they could end me before I even made it out of my driver's seat. When Marco's driver, and yes, he sent a driver in a black Mercedes that's worth more than my student loan debt, had picked me up at precisely 6 a.m. from my apartment building, I'd realized with the kind of sinking certainty that settles in your stomach like lead that this wasn't a job I could simply not show up for, wasn't something I could ghost like a bad Tinder date and hope everyone just forgot about me and moved on with their lives. Now I'm standing in a kitchen that's bigger than my entire apartment, facing a stone-faced housekeeper named Rosa, who's definitely not the same Rosa from the restaurant, and who looks at me like I'm a roach that wandered into her pristine domain. An unwelcome intruder in a space that she's clearly ruled with an iron fist for longer than I've been alive. And all I can think is that I've made a terrible, irreversible mistake that's going to end with me buried in some unmarked grave in the woods surrounding this property. Rosa, Estate Rosa, as I'm calling her in my head to distinguish her from restaurant, Rosa is approximately 60 years old, built like someone who's spent her entire life doing hard physical labor and not taking nonsense from anyone, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it probably gives her a permanent facelift, and eyes that assess me with the kind of thorough disapproval usually reserved for parking tickets and unwanted dinner guests. "Mr. Valentino expects his breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp," she says in accented English that carries the weight of absolute authority, the kind of voice that makes you want to stand up straighter and apologize for things you haven't even done yet. "You will serve him his espresso first, prepared exactly as I will show you, followed by his meal, which you will keep hot but not steaming, presented on the terrace when weather permits or in the breakfast room when it does not, and you will speak only when spoken to. Answer questions directly and briefly, and under absolutely no circumstances will you enter the east wing of this house or ask questions about Mr. Valentino's business affairs, unless you would like your employment here to be extremely brief and extremely unpleasant." She moves through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who's performed these tasks so many times they've become muscle memory, pulling out an espresso machine that looks like it belongs in a spaceship and probably costs more than a semester of tuition, demonstrating the precise method for preparing Marco's morning coffee, with the kind of solemnity usually reserved for religious ceremonies or bomb defusal. I watch and try to memorize every detail while my brain keeps helpfully reminding me that I'm in way over my head, that I'm a waitress from the South Side who barely knows the difference between a cappuccino and a macchiato, and who definitely doesn't belong in a kitchen that has more square footage than most people's entire homes. But I force myself to focus on Rosa's instructions, because the alternative is giving in to the panic that's been building in my chest since I woke up this morning and realized that this was really happening, that I was really going to spend my days serving the most dangerous man in Chicago in his private sanctuary, where witnesses are scarce and bodies could disappear with disturbing ease. 2 sugars, no more, no less, Rosa continues, measuring out the sugar with precision that would make a pharmacist proud. Mr. Valentino is very particular about his routines, and he does not appreciate deviation or creative interpretation. So if you value your continued employment here, you will do exactly as I've shown you, and nothing more. She hands me the cup of espresso that looks perfect, smells divine, and represents everything I need to not screw up if I want to survive this arrangement, and I take it with hands that are steadier than I feel, determined not to show weakness or fear, even though both are currently throwing a party in my nervous system. The terrace where I'm meant to serve breakfast is something out of a magazine spread about how the other half lives, all gleaming marble and comfortable furniture positioned to take advantage of views that stretch across perfectly manicured gardens toward Lake Michigan in the distance, creating a scene of such serene beauty that it's almost possible to forget that this is the home of a man who's built his empire on violence and intimidation, and the kind of power that doesn't come from legitimate business ventures. Marco is already seated at an iron table that's been set with what I'm certain is actual fine china, not the kind of plates you can buy at Target, but the kind that probably has a pedigree and insurance and maybe its own security detail, and he's reading through what appears to be 3 different newspapers simultaneously, while his phone sits within easy reach, occasionally buzzing with messages that he glances at and dismisses with quick efficiency. He doesn't look up when I approach, doesn't acknowledge my presence in any visible way, but I can feel the weight of his awareness like a physical thing, can sense that despite his apparent focus on his newspapers, he knows exactly where I am and what I'm doing with the kind of hypervigilance that probably keeps people like him alive in a world where trust is currency and betrayal is constant. "Your espresso, Mr. Valentino," I say, setting the cup down on the table with a steadiness that I'm genuinely proud of, considering my hands want to shake and my voice wants to crack. And I'm careful to place it exactly where Rosa indicated, on his right side within easy reach, but not so close that it intrudes on his newspaper reading space. He still doesn't look up, doesn't give any indication that he's heard me or cares about my presence, just reaches for the cup with one hand while continuing to read what appears to be the financial section of the Wall Street Journal. And I watch as he takes a sip, waiting with breath held for some sign of approval, or more likely criticism, that will confirm Rosa's warnings about his exacting standards and particular preferences. The silence stretches between us like taffy being pulled to its breaking point, and I'm about to turn and head back to the kitchen to retrieve his breakfast when he finally speaks, his voice carrying that same smooth, dangerous quality that I remember from the restaurant, the kind of voice that makes you listen even when you'd rather not hear what's being said. "You're wondering why I brought you here instead of simply having you fired or worse," he says. And it's not a question, but rather a statement of fact, delivered with the confidence of someone who's very good at reading people and their motivations. You're standing there trying to figure out if this is some elaborate punishment, or if there's another angle you're not seeing. And you're also probably calculating how quickly you could make it to your car if things go badly, which shows more survival instinct than you, displayed at the restaurant but still not quite enough to keep you truly safe. He sets down his espresso cup with deliberate precision, finally looking up at me with those ice-blue eyes that seem to catalog every detail of my appearance, from my carefully neutral expression to the way I'm standing with my weight slightly forward like I'm ready to move at a moment's notice. And I feel stripped bare under that gaze. Feel like he's seeing things about me that I don't even see about myself. "The truth is that I'm not entirely sure why I made you that offer," he continues, and there's something in his voice that might be curiosity, or might be confusion, or might be the first hint of an obsession that's going to consume us both. "I should have let Luca handle you the way we handle all problems, quickly and permanently and without witnesses who might feel compelled to talk. But instead I find myself sitting here waiting for my breakfast to be served by a woman who looked me in the eyes and told me not to dare her. And I'm trying to understand what that says about either your stupidity or your courage. Before I can formulate a response that won't get me killed, Rosa appears with a tray laden with Marco's breakfast. Perfectly poached eggs, prosciutto that probably costs more per pound than I make in a day, fresh fruit arranged with artistic precision, and bread that smells like it was baked this morning by someone who takes carbohydrates very seriously. I take the tray from her with a nod of thanks, and begin setting out Marco's breakfast with the careful attention to detail that Rosa drilled into me, aware that he's watching my every movement with that same unsettling focus, aware that this is some kind of test that I don't fully understand but definitely cannot afford to fail. My mother used to say that the difference between stupidity and courage is whether you survive the decision, I hear myself saying, and I'm not entirely sure why I'm offering this piece of personal information to a man who could use it against me in countless ways. She wasn't usually right about much, spent most of my childhood making choices that fell firmly in the stupidity category, but that particular piece of wisdom has stuck with me through the years, so I guess we'll find out which category my decision falls into, based on whether I'm still alive and employed at the end of this arrangement. Something shifts in Marco's expression, a minute change that I wouldn't have caught if I wasn't already hyper-aware of his every micro-expression, and he picks up his fork with movements that are somehow both elegant and predatory. Like even the act of eating breakfast is something he's turned into an art form that doubles as intimidation. "Your mother is dead," he says. And it's not a question because of course he already knows this. Of course he's had his people dig into every aspect of my life from birth certificates to credit scores. Cancer, prolonged illness, medical bills that bankrupted you and forced you to drop out of medical school in your second year, currently working 2 jobs to pay off debt that wasn't even yours to begin with, while trying to save enough to reapply to finish your degree. He says all of this while cutting his eggs with surgical precision, not looking at me but making it clear that he knows things about me that I've never told anyone, that he's had me investigated with the kind of thoroughness that should probably terrify me more than it does. So the question becomes, Sarah Winters, why someone with your intelligence and your obvious determination to become a doctor would throw it all away by insulting my enforcer and challenging me in front of my men and half of Chicago's elite. And I think the answer is that you're so exhausted from trying to survive that you've stopped caring about consequences, which makes you either very dangerous or very useful. And I haven't decided which yet. The accuracy of his assessment hits me like a physical blow, strips away the defenses I didn't even realize I'd built up, and I find myself setting down the serving tray with less grace than I intended. My hands suddenly unsteady in a way they weren't before because having your life and your motivations laid out by a virtual stranger feels invasive and intimate in equal measure. If you already know everything about me, then you know I can't afford to lose this job no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous it might be, I say, and I'm proud that my voice comes out steady, even though my internal landscape is anything but. So whatever test this is, whatever game you're playing by bringing me here and serving you breakfast while you psychoanalyze my life choices, I'll play along, because I don't have the luxury of pride or fear, or whatever emotion you're expecting me to display right now. I meet his eyes directly, refusing to look away first, even though every instinct is screaming at me that you don't challenge apex predators, you don't stare down wolves and expect to walk away unbitten. But I've already established that my survival instincts are clearly defective, so I might as well commit to the brand at this point. Marco leans back in his chair, and for the first time since I've entered his presence this morning, something that might be a smile ghosts across his face. There and gone so quickly I might have imagined it if I wasn't watching him with the intensity of someone studying a particularly fascinating and deadly specimen. I'm going to tell you something that very few people know, and I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the position you've put yourself in by accepting my offer, he says, setting down his fork and giving me his complete attention in a way that makes the air feel thicker, harder to breathe. Every person who works in this house, who serves me or protects me or exists in my orbit, is here because they've proven their loyalty through blood or family ties or years of service that bought them the privilege of proximity to power. But you're here because you made me curious, and curiosity is a dangerous thing for a man in my position because it implies vulnerability, implies that there's something I want that I don't already have. He stands up, and suddenly the space between us feels both too much and not enough, and I have to resist the urge to step back as he approaches with the kind of controlled movement that predators use when they're not hunting, but definitely not playing either. What do you want from me? I ask, because it seems like the kind of question that deserves to be spoken aloud rather than left hanging in the charged air between us. And I'm genuinely curious what his answer will be because I can't figure out his angle, can't understand why a man who has everything he could possibly want would care about one stubborn waitress with more debts than sense. He stops close enough that I can smell his cologne, something that smells like money and danger, and the kind of confident masculinity that probably comes from never having to question your place in the world's hierarchy. And when he speaks, his voice has dropped to something that feels intimate, despite the very public setting of the terrace with its views and its witnesses in the form of guards positioned at strategic points around the property. I want to understand why you're not afraid of me, he says simply. And there's something raw in his voice that catches me off guard, something that sounds almost human beneath the carefully constructed armor of the feared Mafia boss. Everyone is afraid of me, Sarah. Everyone who knows my name or my reputation or what I'm capable of doing to people who cross me. But you looked at me covered in wine with my men ready to hurt you, and you laughed, you challenged us. You acted like we were an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. And I need to know if that's because you're genuinely fearless, or because you've already given up on living and therefore have nothing left to lose. His hand comes up, and I tense automatically. But he doesn't touch me. Just lets his fingers hover near my cheek like he's testing whether I'll flinch, whether this close proximity will finally crack my composure and reveal the fear he's expecting to find. I don't flinch, and I'm not entirely sure why. Not entirely sure if it's stubbornness or exhaustion or something else entirely. Something that has to do with the way his proximity makes my pulse race for reasons that have nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the attraction that I absolutely cannot afford to feel for a man who's probably killed more people than I've served dinner to. Maybe it's both, I admit, because lying to him seems pointless when he's already demonstrated that he knows more about me than I know about myself. Maybe I'm tired enough to be fearless and scared enough to be reckless, and maybe standing here with you close enough to hurt me is the most alive I've felt since my mother died and took all my plans and my future with her. So if you're looking for a simple answer to why I'm not trembling and begging for mercy, I don't have one to give you. The honesty tastes bitter on my tongue, feels like giving him ammunition that he could use to destroy me. But something about this moment demands truth rather than self-preservation. Demands that I show him the real person beneath the defensive posturing and the exhausted bravado. Whatever he sees in my face seems to satisfy something in him, because he finally steps back, putting distance between us that feels both like relief and loss. And he returns to his breakfast like this intense moment of connection never happened, like he didn't just strip me down to my fundamental truths on his terrace overlooking his kingdom. Luca will be here shortly to give you your schedule and your boundaries, Marco says, his voice returning to that neutral professional tone that suggests we're employer and employee, rather than two people who just shared something uncomfortably intimate. You'll serve my meals, attend to any needs I have during business meetings in the house, and maintain the same schedule you've been keeping with your other jobs because I'm not interested in owning all of your time, just the portions of it that serve my purposes. He pauses, and something in his expression shifts again, becomes calculating in a way that makes my skin prickle with awareness of danger. And Sarah? The East Wing is off limits not because I'm trying to be mysterious, or because I enjoy arbitrary rules, but because that's where I conduct business that you absolutely do not want to witness or become aware of, so if you value your life and your sanity, you'll respect that boundary without testing it the way you seem to enjoy testing everything else. Before I can respond, the sound of footsteps announces Luca's arrival, and the massive enforcer appears on the terrace with the kind of presence that makes the space feel smaller, more contained. His expression when he looks at me carrying a mix of contempt and grudging respect that suggests Marco has told him about our conversation, and he's not thrilled about having to treat me like something other than a problem to be eliminated. "Boss?" he says with a nod to Marco that carries years of loyalty and understanding. "We have a situation with the shipment from the docks, requires your immediate attention, and Dimitri called about the thing we discussed regarding the Russos and their latest territorial push into our distribution networks." He hands Marco a phone that's definitely not the one that was sitting on the breakfast table, something encrypted and secure and probably untraceable. And Marco takes it with an expression that transforms him from the curious man who was questioning me about fear into the cold, efficient crime lord who's built an empire on calculated violence. "Rosa will show you the rest of the house and explain your duties in detail," Marco says to me without looking up from whatever message he's reading on the secure phone. His attention already shifted to matters that are infinitely more important than one new employee who doesn't know her place. "Luca, with me, and call in the accountant, because if those numbers are right, then someone is stealing from us, and they're about to learn why that's the last mistake they'll ever make." He strides off the terrace with Luca following like a lethal shadow, and I'm left standing there with dirty breakfast dishes, and the lingering scent of his cologne, and the distinct impression that I just survived something significant, even though I'm not entirely sure what it was. And as Rosa appears to collect me with her stern efficiency and obvious disapproval of whatever just transpired, I realize that working for Marco Valentino is going to be infinitely more complicated than I imagined. And the danger isn't going to come from the violence I expected, but from the connection I'm starting to feel to a man who should be nothing more than my employer and my ticket to paying off my debts, but who's somehow becoming something else entirely, something that makes me want to understand the person beneath the reputation. And that curiosity, that desire to know him, is probably going to be the thing that destroys me in the end, because you can't get close to fire without getting burned, and Marco Valentino is an inferno waiting to consume everything I am. 3 weeks into this arrangement, and I've learned 3 critical things about Marco Valentino that nobody puts in the cautionary tales they tell about Chicago's most dangerous crime lord. 1. He takes his espresso with exactly 2 sugars and no small talk, preferring his mornings wrapped in silence and newspapers, while the rest of his empire wakes up and begins the daily business of organized crime. 2. He hasn't touched me once, despite the electricity that crackles between us every time we're in the same room, despite the way his eyes follow me with an intensity that makes my skin feel too tight and my breath come too fast, despite the fact that I've caught him watching me with an expression that looks like hunger wrapped in iron control. And 3, he's testing me constantly, creating little scenarios and situations designed to see if I'll break or bend or finally show the fear that he seems convinced must be lurking beneath my stubborn exterior, waiting for me to either prove myself worthy of whatever trust he's considering extending, or prove that I'm just another person who will eventually disappoint him, the way I suspect everyone in his life eventually does. But here's what Marco hasn't learned about me in these 3 weeks of careful observation and controlled proximity, what he can't seem to understand no matter how many background checks he runs or how many psychological games he plays. I grew up with an addict mother who taught me that survival means adapting to chaos, worked 3 jobs through college while watching her waste away in a hospital bed that cost more per day than most people make in a month, and fought tooth and nail for everything I have, including my sanity, and my stubborn refusal to let the world grind me down into something small and scared. So if he thinks a few heated stares and carefully orchestrated proximity are going to make me fall at his feet like every other woman in his orbit, who sees his power and his danger and his ridiculous cheekbones and decides that's enough to build a fantasy on, he's about to be severely disappointed. Or maybe not. And that's the problem that's been keeping me up at night, making me stare at the ceiling of my studio apartment during the few hours between leaving Marco's estate and heading to my shift at the diner. Because the truth is that somewhere between serving him breakfast and watching him conduct business with the kind of cold efficiency that should terrify me but instead fascinates me, I've started seeing him as more than just my dangerous employer. Started noticing the way his jaw tightens when he's stressed, the way his fingers drum against his desk when he's thinking through a problem, the way he sometimes looks at me like I'm a puzzle he desperately wants to solve, but isn't sure he should spend the time trying. Last night was when everything shifted from manageable tension to something far more dangerous, when I crossed a line I didn't even know existed until I was already on the wrong side of it, because I'd been studying in the estate library after my evening shift. Marco had told me I could use any room in the house except the east wing, and the library was quiet and beautiful, and had better lighting than my apartment. And I must have fallen asleep somewhere between memorizing amino acid structures and reviewing organic chemistry equations. Exhaustion finally claiming the victory it had been fighting for, ever since I started this insane schedule of serving a mob boss by day and slinging hash by night while trying to study for the MCAT in whatever scattered hours remained. When I woke up, I wasn't in the library anymore, but rather in a bedroom that was clearly Marco's based on the masculine decor and the scent of his cologne that permeated everything from the sheets to the air itself. Tucked into his bed like something precious rather than an employee who'd inconveniently passed out in his personal space, covered by his suit jacket that still held the warmth of his body and probably cost more than my monthly rent. On the nightstand beside the bed, positioned where I couldn't possibly miss it, was a note written in handwriting that was surprisingly elegant for a man whose reputation was built on violence, and the message was brief enough to be almost dismissive but carried implications that made my heart do complicated things in my chest. "You're playing a dangerous game, Piccola. Make sure you know the rules." The note wasn't signed, didn't need to be, and I'd lain there for several long minutes, trying to process the fact that Marco Valentino had apparently carried me to his bedroom, tucked me into his personal bed, and left me a note that was either a warning or an invitation, or possibly both simultaneously. And I couldn't decide if I should be terrified or intrigued, or possibly running for the hills before whatever was building between us exploded into something neither of us could control. That was last night, and now I'm serving Marco his breakfast on the terrace like nothing has changed. Like I didn't wake up wrapped in his expensive sheets, with his scent surrounding me and his words echoing in my head. Like the tension between us hasn't ratcheted up to levels that feel almost unbearable in their intensity. And he's reading his newspapers with the same focused attention he always does, giving no indication that anything is different, or that he's even aware of my presence beyond the basic acknowledgement of accepting his espresso when I set it down. The silence stretches between us like it has every morning for 3 weeks. But today it feels weighted with things unsaid, with questions that hang in the air, demanding answers that neither of us seems willing to provide. And I'm about to retreat to the kitchen where Rosa is probably waiting to grill me about why I didn't come home last night, when Marco finally speaks, his voice carrying that same dangerous smoothness that makes every word feel significant. "You didn't go home last night," he says, still not looking up from his Wall Street Journal, still maintaining that facade of casual disinterest that we both know is complete fiction. "Rosa was concerned when you weren't in the kitchen this morning at your usual time, thought perhaps something had happened to you, or that you'd finally come to your senses, and decided to run as far from this situation as your questionable car could carry you." He takes a sip of his espresso, and I watch the movement of his throat as he swallows. Watch the way the morning light catches in his dark hair that's slightly disheveled like he didn't sleep well. And I'm struck by how unfairly attractive he is, even when he's being deliberately obtuse about the fact that he definitely knows exactly where I was last night, because he's the one who put me there. "I told her you were fine, that you'd simply fallen asleep studying, and I didn't want to disturb you since you clearly needed the rest more than you needed to maintain the pretense that you're capable of sustaining your current schedule indefinitely, without collapsing from exhaustion." The implication that he cares about my well-being, that he's paying attention to my exhaustion and my struggles in a way that goes beyond employer observation and into something more personal, more intimate, makes something warm unfurl in my chest, something dangerous that I absolutely cannot afford to feel for a man who represents everything I should be running from. "Thank you for not leaving me in the library," I say, because acknowledging what happened seems safer than ignoring it. Seems like the kind of direct honesty that Marco appears to value even when it makes things complicated. Though I'm not sure how I feel about waking up in your bed without any memory of how I got there, which is a sentence I never thought I'd have to say to my employer, and which probably violates several workplace safety protocols that definitely don't apply in organized crime but probably should. I'm aiming for light, for humor that might diffuse some of the tension that's making it hard to breathe properly. But my voice comes out softer than intended, more vulnerable. And I watch as Marco finally sets down his newspaper and turns his full attention to me with an expression that makes my pulse spike, and my carefully maintained composure threaten to crack completely. "I carried you," he says simply, like this is a normal thing that bosses do for their employees. Like the image of him lifting my unconscious body and taking me to his private space isn't something that's going to live in my imagination for an indefinite period of time. "You were dead asleep in the library chair with your textbook open on your lap, and your notes scattered around you like evidence of how hard you're pushing yourself. And I stood there for probably longer than I should have just watching you sleep because it was the first time since you started working here that you looked peaceful, instead of exhausted or defiant, or some combination of both." He stands up, abandoning his breakfast completely, moving toward me with that predatory grace that makes every instinct scream danger while simultaneously making parts of me that have no business responding to danger sit up and pay very close attention. "I should have woken you up and sent you home like any reasonable employer would do, should have maintained the professional boundaries that are already dangerously thin between us. But instead I took you to my room because the guest rooms felt wrong somehow. Felt like I was keeping you at a distance when what I actually wanted was to have you in my space, surrounded by my scent. In my bed where I could imagine what it would be like if you were there by choice rather than unconscious necessity." The raw honesty of his confession hits me like a physical blow, strips away any pretense that what's happening between us is simple or professional, or anything other than completely inappropriate, and probably disastrous. And I find myself backing up until I hit the terrace railing, trapped between the view of his perfect gardens and the man himself who's still approaching, with an expression that's equal parts hunger and restraint. "Marco," I say, and his name feels dangerous on my tongue. Feels like I'm crossing a boundary by using it instead of the formal address that Rosa insisted I maintain. "We can't do this, whatever this is, because I need this job and I need to not complicate my already impossibly complicated life by getting involved with my employer, who also happens to be a crime lord with enemies and violence and a lifestyle that has absolutely no space for someone like me." I'm saying all the right things, all the reasonable things that my rational brain is screaming at me to say, but my body hasn't gotten the memo because I'm not moving away, not pushing him back, not doing any of the things that would actually enforce the boundaries I'm claiming to want. "You think I don't know that?" he asks, and there's frustration in his voice now. Frustration in something that sounds like pain, like he's fighting the same battle I am and losing just as badly. "You think I haven't spent the last 3 weeks trying to convince myself that this attraction is just curiosity? Just the novelty of someone who isn't afraid of me? Just my ego responding to the challenge you represent? I've built my entire life on control, Sarah, on never letting emotions compromise my judgment, on keeping everything and everyone at a carefully calculated distance so that I can make the hard decisions that running an empire requires. But then you stumbled into my world covered in wine and attitude, and you looked at me like I was just a man instead of a monster. And now I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop watching you. Can't stop wanting things that I have no business wanting from someone who deserves so much better than what I can offer." He's close enough now that I can feel the heat radiating from his body, can see the storm of emotions playing across his face that usually maintains such perfect control. And I realize that this moment is a precipice, that what happens next is going to determine the trajectory of everything that follows. What if I don't want better? I hear myself asking, and the words feel like jumping off a cliff without checking if there's water below. Feel like the most honest and most foolish thing I've said since walking into his life. What if I'm tired of safe and reasonable and making all the right choices that lead to struggling and exhaustion and watching my dreams get further away no matter how hard I work toward them? What if looking at you doesn't make me see a monster, but rather someone who understands what it's like to fight for everything you have? Who knows that survival sometimes means making choices that other people judge but that you know are necessary? Who sees me as more than just another person to protect or control, but as someone who might actually be strong enough to stand beside you rather than behind you? The confession comes out in a rush. Words I didn't know I was thinking, until they're already spoken. Already hanging between us like a challenge or a surrender. And I watch as something shifts in Marco's expression, as the careful control he maintains begins to crack under the weight of whatever he's been holding back. "If you stay, if you let this happen, there's no going back," he says, his voice rough with emotion barely contained, with desire and warning tangled together until they're indistinguishable. "I don't do casual, Sarah. I don't do temporary. And if I let myself have you, then you become mine in every way that matters, which means I'll own you and possess you and destroy anyone who tries to take you from me. Which means your life stops being your own and starts being something we share. Which means you need to be absolutely certain this is what you want, because I won't be able to let you go once I have you." His hand comes up to cup my face, and this time there's no hovering, no testing. Just the solid warmth of his palm against my cheek, while his thumb traces my bottom lip with a gentleness that seems at odds with everything I know about him. And I realize that this is Marco without his armor, without his carefully maintained distance, offering me something real and dangerous, and potentially devastating. I should step back, should remember all the very good reasons why getting involved with Marco Valentino is a terrible idea that will probably end with me in witness protection or worse. Should think about my goals and my future, and the medical career I'm still trying to build from the wreckage of my mother's death. But instead I lean into his touch like I've been starving for it. Like these 3 weeks of careful distance and unresolved tension have been slowly killing me, and this contact is oxygen after drowning. "Then I guess I should stop thinking about going back," I whisper, And I watch as my words land, as they register in his expression that's transforming from restrained to ravenous. And I barely have time to take a breath before he's closing the distance between us completely. Before his mouth is on mine with a hunger that's been building for 3 weeks. Of watching and waiting and wanting. And I'm kissing him back with equal desperation, with 3 weeks of my own denied desire pouring into this moment that feels both inevitable and impossible. The kiss is nothing like I imagined, nothing soft or gentle or tentative, but rather a claiming that steals my breath and my thoughts, and possibly my sanity. Marco's hands tangling in my hair, while mine grip his shirt, like I'm trying to hold on to something solid in a world that's suddenly spinning out of control. And I can taste coffee and want, and 3 weeks of restraint breaking apart under the force of finally giving in to what we've both been fighting. When he finally pulls back, we're both breathing hard, both looking at each other with a combination of desire and disbelief. And I can see in his eyes that this changes everything, that we've crossed a line that neither of us can uncross no matter what happens next. "This is insane," I managed to say, my voice shakier than I'd like, my lips still tingling from the intensity of his kiss. "This is absolutely the worst decision I've ever made, and I've made some spectacularly bad decisions in my 24 years on this planet." "Probably," Marco agrees. But he's smiling now, really smiling in a way I've never seen before. Something genuine and almost boyish that makes him look younger and more human and infinitely more dangerous to my emotional well-being. But we're going to do it anyway because I've spent 3 weeks trying to be reasonable and professional, and it's made me miserable. And I didn't build everything I have by playing it safe or making the smart choice. I built it by taking what I wanted and dealing with the consequences later. He kisses me again. Shorter this time, but no less intense. And when he pulls back, his expression has shifted into something more serious, more concerned. "But you need to understand what you're signing up for here, Piccola. You need to know that my world is dangerous and violent and full of people who would love nothing more than to use you against me. Which means, if we do this, if we make this real, then your safety becomes my obsession and your freedom becomes negotiable because I can't lose you, won't survive losing someone else I care about." Before I can respond to this declaration that should probably terrify me but instead makes me feel valued in a way I haven't felt since my mother died, before I can process the implications of Marco Valentino admitting that he cares about me and that he's willing to restrict my freedom to keep me safe, the sound of rapid footsteps interrupts us, and Luca appears on the terrace with an expression that immediately transforms Marco from the man who was just kissing me, like I was essential to his survival, back into the cold crime lord who makes life and death decisions before breakfast. "Boss, we have a problem," Luca says, his eyes flicking to me briefly, with an expression that suggests he knows exactly what he just interrupted, and isn't particularly happy about it. "There's been an attack on the warehouse in Pilsen, 3 of our men dead and the shipment stolen, and the Russos left a message specifically about your new pet. Said that Valentino's getting soft if he's letting pretty waitresses distract him from business. Said maybe they should remind him what happens when you take your eyes off what matters." The words land like bullets, each one finding its target, and I watch as Marco's expression goes from concerned to absolutely murderous in the span of a heartbeat, as every soft edge that was present moments ago disappears behind the armor of the man who survived in this world by being more brutal than his enemies. "Increase security on the estate immediately," Marco orders, his voice cold and precise, and nothing like the rough want that colored it moments ago. "Double the guards on every entrance, run background checks on anyone who's been hired in the last month, and get me everything we have on Russo movements in the past week because someone told them about Sarah, and I want to know who, and I want them brought to me alive so I can personally demonstrate what happens to traitors in my organization." He turns to me, and there's something in his eyes that's both apology and command, both regret and determination. "You're moving into the estate permanently starting today. Not as my employee, but as someone under my protection, and I don't want to hear arguments about your independence or your other job or anything else, because the Russos just declared open season on you, and I will burn this entire city down before I let them touch you. Marco, I can't just move in here. I have a lease and a life and responsibilities that don't disappear just because some rival family mentioned me in their criminal correspondence. I start to protest, but he cuts me off with a look that makes it clear this isn't a negotiation, isn't something I get to have input on. And I feel the first stirrings of the fear I should have felt 3 weeks ago when I first walked into this world. The understanding that dating Marco Valentino means giving up control over my own safety, my own choices, my own life in ways that I'm only just beginning to comprehend. This is what you meant about ownership, I say, realization dawning cold and clear. This is what you were warning me about when you said there's no going back, that if I let this happen, then my life stops being my own. Yes, he says simply, brutally honest in a way that I'm learning is characteristic of him when it comes to the things that matter. This is exactly what I meant. And if you want to walk away, then you need to do it now. Before this gets any worse. Before I become so invested in keeping you alive that I lose whatever small amount of perspective I still have left. But if you stay, if you choose this, then you accept that your safety is now my priority, and your independence is negotiable, and your life is tangled with mine in ways that are permanent and possibly catastrophic. He cups my face again, gentle despite the violence humming under his skin, despite the rage I can feel building in him over the threat to me, over the fact that the Russos have forced his hand and made me a target. Tell me what you want, Sarah. Tell me if you're strong enough for this, or if I need to let you go before we both get destroyed by what's building between us. I look at him standing there with death in his eyes and tenderness in his touch, at this man who's offering me something that's equal parts protection and possession. And I think about my studio apartment with its leaky faucet and its neighbors who blast music at 2 a.m. Think about the freedom to make my own choices even when they're hard. Think about medical school and the future I've been fighting for, and whether any of it matters if I'm not with someone who sees me as more than just another person to save or fix or manage. And I realize that maybe the scariest thing isn't Marco's world of violence and danger, but rather the fact that I want to stay in it, want to belong to him in all the ways he's offering, want to choose this insanity over the safe, reasonable path that's left me exhausted and alone, and wondering if surviving is the same thing as living. I want to stay, I say, and I watch as relief and triumph and something that might be love flashes across his face before he's kissing me again, before he's holding me like I'm precious and essential and worth burning the world for. And as Luca clears his throat awkwardly in the background, and Marco reluctantly pulls away to deal with the crisis that's threatening to consume us both, I realize that I've just made a choice that's going to define the rest of my life, that I've chosen Marco Valentino and his dangerous world over safety and certainty. And as he walks away with Luca talking in rapid Italian about security protocols and retaliation plans, as I stand alone on the terrace trying to process everything that just happened in the span of 20 minutes, my phone buzzes in my pocket with a text from an unknown number that makes my blood run cold. He can't protect you forever, pretty girl. We'll be seeing you soon. VR. And I realize that choosing Marco means I've just painted a target on my back that might get me killed. But the truly terrifying part is that even knowing this, even seeing the threat spelled out in black and white on my phone screen, I wouldn't change my decision, wouldn't choose safety over him, which means I'm either in love or insane or possibly both, and I'm about to find out which in the most dangerous way possible. You know that moment when you realize you've officially lost your mind, when you cross over from making questionable life choices into full-blown insanity territory, where rational thought goes to die, and pure stubborn determination takes over like a hostile takeover of your survival instincts. Mine comes when I'm zip-tied to a chair in a Russo warehouse that smells like oil and rust, and the particular brand of masculine overconfidence that comes from men who think kidnapping and torture are legitimate business strategies, face-to-face with Victor Russo himself, who looks exactly like what you'd get if you ordered a Bond villain from a discount website. And instead of begging for my life like a sane person would do in this situation, like any reasonable human being who values their continued existence would absolutely be doing right now, I'm calculating how many seconds I have before Marco storms this place like the wrath of God, wrapped in Italian tailoring, and paints these walls red with the blood of everyone stupid enough to think that taking me was a good strategic move. Victor thinks I'm leverage, thinks I'm a weak point in Marco Valentino's otherwise impenetrable armor, thinks I'm just Marco's pretty little distraction that he can use to break the unbreakable crime lord who's built his entire reputation on being harder and colder and more ruthless than anyone else in Chicago's underworld. And I can see in his eyes that he's already planning exactly how he's going to use me, exactly what he's going to do to make Marco suffer before he finally puts a bullet in both our heads and claims whatever territory he thinks he's entitled to in this endless game of violent chess that these men play with human lives. But here's what Victor doesn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, because he's clearly spent his entire life underestimating women and mistaking fear for weakness and confusing silence for submission. I didn't fall for Marco despite the violence and darkness that surrounds him like an expensive cologne. Didn't choose him in spite of the danger and the blood and the moral compromises that come with loving a man whose empire is built on activities that would give law enforcement officials wet dreams about RICO charges. I fell for him because I finally found someone as relentlessly stubborn as I am. Someone who doesn't flinch when life gets hard. Someone who doesn't break under pressure but instead becomes something harder and sharper and more dangerous. Someone who looks at the world's attempts to destroy him and says, "Not today," with the kind of conviction that makes the universe think twice about its plans. So when Victor leans in close enough that I can smell the cigarettes and expensive scotch on his breath, close enough that I can see the pores on his face and the cruel satisfaction in his eyes, close enough that he probably thinks he's intimidating me into compliance, or at least into some display of the fear that he's expecting, and asks me in heavily accented English if I'm afraid of what's going to happen to me now that I'm in his power, I look him dead in those cold, calculating eyes, and say the same thing that started this whole beautiful disaster, the same words that got me into this mess and that somehow feel appropriate for what might be my final moments. Man, don't dare me, because I've survived worse than you on less sleep and with worse odds, and the only thing you've accomplished by bringing me here is guaranteeing that Marco Valentino is going to make your death so memorable that people will still be talking about it decades from now as a cautionary tale about what happens when you touch things that belong to him. The reaction is immediate and exactly what I was hoping for. Victor's face transforms from smugly confident to genuinely angry in the space of a heartbeat, his hand coming up to strike me with enough force that my head snaps to the side and I taste blood in my mouth, metallic and warm. But I just turn back to look at him with a smile that's probably more feral than friendly, and spit the blood onto his expensive shoes, because if I'm going to die in this warehouse, then I'm going to die on my own terms, with my dignity intact, and my middle finger firmly extended to the universe that keeps trying to make me small and scared and apologetic for taking up space. "You think your boyfriend is coming to save you?" Victor asks, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage that suggests I've hit a nerve, that maybe he's not as confident about this plan as he's pretending to be. "You think Marco Valentino cares enough about some waitress he's been fucking for a few weeks to risk open war with my family, to throw away years of carefully maintained territory agreements and peace treaties, to potentially destroy everything he's built just to retrieve one insignificant woman who should have known better than to spread her legs for a monster?" His words are meant to hurt, meant to make me doubt Marco's feelings for me, meant to plant seeds of insecurity that will make me easier to break. But all they do is make me laugh. A genuine sound of amusement that echoes in the warehouse and clearly confuses everyone present because women in my position aren't supposed to laugh, aren't supposed to find humor in their own impending torture and death. "The thing is, Victor, you've made a fundamental miscalculation about who Marco is and what I mean to him," I say, my voice steady despite the pain radiating from my cheek where he hit me, despite the zip ties cutting into my wrists and the very real possibility that I'm wrong about everything, and Marco isn't coming, and I'm about to die alone in this warehouse for the crime of falling in love with the wrong man. You think he's going to weigh the cost-benefit analysis of saving me versus maintaining peace? Think he's going to be rational and strategic and make the smart business decision to cut his losses and let you have your petty revenge? But what you don't understand is that Marco stopped being rational, where I'm concerned the moment I told him not to dare me in his own restaurant. And now that I'm his, now that he's claimed me in every way that matters, you didn't just take a woman he's fond of. You took something that belongs to him in the most fundamental sense. And there is no amount of territory or money or strategic advantage that's going to stop him from tearing through your entire organization to get me back. I pause, letting my words sink in, watching as something that might be doubt flickers across Victor's face. So the real question isn't whether Marco's coming. It's whether you're smart enough to let me go before he gets here and maybe, just maybe, survives this colossal error in judgment you've made by thinking I'm a weakness you can exploit instead of the line in the sand that's going to get you killed. Before Victor can respond with what I'm sure would be more threats or violence or some combination of both. Before this standoff can escalate further into whatever finale he's been planning, the sound of vehicles screeching to a halt outside the warehouse announces Marco's arrival, with all the subtlety of a natural disaster. And I watch as Victor's confidence visibly wavers, as he realizes that maybe, just maybe, he's miscalculated badly, and is about to pay the price for his hubris. "It seems your prince has arrived," Victor says, trying to regain his composure, trying to sound like he's still in control of this situation, even as his men are scrambling to defensive positions and checking their weapons with the nervous energy of people who know they're outgunned and outmatched. "Let's see if he's willing to trade himself for you, if his love is strong enough to sacrifice everything he's built for one insignificant woman. And if he refuses, well, then you'll learn exactly how much you actually mean to him in the most painful way possible." He pulls out his phone, presumably to contact Marco and lay out his demands, but before he can make the call, before he can set whatever trap he's been planning into motion, I do something that surprises everyone, including myself. I throw my weight backward, tipping the chair I'm tied to over, and using the momentum to bring my bound hands down hard on the zip ties against the chair's metal frame. A technique that Marco taught me during one of our late-night conversations about self-defense and survival, during those quiet hours after dinner, when he'd insisted on teaching me how to escape various restraints, because he lived in constant fear that someone would take me, and he wouldn't be there to protect me. The zip ties break on the second impact, the cheap plastic giving way under the force and the angle, and suddenly my hands are free, and I'm rolling away from Victor's grabbing hands and coming up in a crouch near a stack of crates that provides temporary cover from the three men who are now pointing guns at me with expressions that range from shocked to impressed to absolutely murderous. "I told you not to dare me," I say, and I can hear the adrenaline making my voice shake slightly. But I don't care because I'm free, and Marco is outside, and I've just proven that I'm not the helpless victim Victor assumed I would be, that I've been paying attention to everything Marco taught me, that I've learned to survive in his world, not by hiding behind him, but by becoming someone who can stand beside him. The warehouse erupts into chaos as Marco's forces breach the entrances, as gunfire fills the air with sound and fury, as the careful standoff dissolves into the kind of brutal violence that I've come to understand is how problems get solved in this world. And I stay low behind my makeshift cover, making myself as small a target as possible while watching for an opportunity to either help or escape, or do something other than just waiting to see who wins this battle for my life and my future. Marco appears like vengeance personified, moving through the warehouse with Luca and what looks like half his organization backing him up. And the look on his face when he spots me is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Relief and rage and love and promise all mixed together into an expression that makes it clear that Victor's fate was sealed the moment he decided to take me, that there's no negotiation or mercy or strategic retreat that's going to save him from what's coming. "Sarah, stay down." Marco shouts across the chaos, his voice cutting through the gunfire and the shouting with the kind of command that makes me automatically obey. And I watch as he and his men systematically dismantle the Russo forces with the efficiency of people who've done this before, who know exactly how to clear a hostile space and eliminate threats with minimal risk to themselves. Victor tries to run, tries to use the confusion to escape out a back entrance, But Luca intercepts him with the kind of timing that suggests they've planned for exactly this scenario, that they knew Victor would try to flee when things went badly. And suddenly the Russo boss is on his knees with a gun to his head, and Marco is standing over him with an expression that promises pain and death in measures that probably violate several Geneva Conventions. "You made a critical error tonight, Victor," Marco says, his voice cold enough to freeze blood, calm enough to be absolutely terrifying. "You took something that belongs to me, something precious and irreplaceable, and you thought that would make me weak, would give you leverage, would somehow accomplish what years of your family's pathetic attempts at expansion couldn't manage." He crouches down to Victor's level, getting close enough that I can see the Russo boss flinch, can see him realize that he's not going to walk away from this warehouse alive. "But what you actually did was give me permission to end this territorial dispute permanently, to eliminate your entire organization as a threat, to send a message to every other family in Chicago that there are lines you don't cross and people you don't touch, and you've just demonstrated what happens when someone is stupid enough to ignore those boundaries." Marco stands up, nodding to Luca in some prearranged signal, and I know I should probably look away, should give Victor privacy in his final moments. But I find I can't tear my eyes away from the scene. Can't pretend I don't want to see justice or revenge or whatever we're calling this executed for the crime of threatening my life and my future with Marco. The gunshot is loud in the enclosed space, final in its implications. And then Victor Russo is just a body on the warehouse floor. Just another casualty in the endless war for power and territory that defines this world. And I should probably feel something about watching a man die. Should have some moral crisis about the fact that his death makes me feel safer rather than guilty. But all I feel is relief that it's over, that the immediate threat has been neutralized, that I can stop being afraid every time I close my eyes that the Russos are going to take everything I care about away from me in the most violent way possible. Marco is at my side immediately, pulling me up from behind the crates and running his hands over me checking for injuries with the kind of thorough attention that speaks to exactly how terrified he was during this entire ordeal. And when he confirms that I'm relatively unharmed, aside from the bruise forming on my cheek from Victor's strike, he pulls me against his chest with enough force to temporarily restrict my breathing, holding me like he's afraid I'll disappear if he loosens his grip even slightly. "Don't ever do that again," he says into my hair, his voice rough with emotion that he's not even trying to hide anymore. "Don't ever trade yourself for someone else's safety. Don't ever put yourself in danger to protect other people. Don't ever make me feel what I felt when I realized you'd gone to that meeting point alone, and I couldn't stop you, couldn't protect you, couldn't do anything except mobilize my entire organization and pray that I'd reach you before Victor did something irreversible." His hands are shaking against my back, tremors running through his normally controlled body that reveal just how close he came to losing his carefully maintained composure. And I realize that this moment, this rescue, has stripped away all his defenses and shown me the man beneath the crime lord, the person who's capable of loving so deeply that the thought of losing me unmade him in ways that bullets and betrayal never have. "I'm sorry," I say, meaning it, understanding that my choice to trade myself for Emma was simultaneously the right thing to do, and absolutely the worst thing I could have done to Marco's peace of mind. But she's my family, Marco. She's the only person who stayed when everyone else left, and I couldn't let her die because of me, because of my choices, because I fell in love with you and made myself a target that your enemies could use. I pull back enough to look at his face, to see the war of emotions playing across his features, to let him see that I'm here and alive and not going anywhere despite the trauma of tonight. But I also need you to understand that I meant what I said to Victor, that I wasn't afraid because I knew you were coming. I knew you'd tear the city apart to find me. I knew that being yours means I'm never really alone even when I'm surrounded by enemies, and that knowledge, that absolute certainty that you'd come for me, is what kept me fighting instead of giving in to the fear that would have made this so much worse. You freed yourself, Marco says, and there's something like pride mixing with the lingering fear in his expression. Rosa told me about the zip tie technique I taught you, said she saw you practicing it in the kitchen when you thought no one was watching. and seeing you actually use it, seeing you apply what I taught you to save yourself, made me realize that you're not the liability I kept worrying you'd be. You're not someone I need to protect from this world. You're someone who's learned to navigate it, to survive it, to become strong enough that you can stand beside me instead of behind me. He cups my face in both hands, careful of the bruise, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones with a gentleness that seems at odds with the violence he just orchestrated on my behalf. You were right when you said you were fearless, Piccola. You were right when you told me you were strong enough for my world, and I'm sorry I doubted you. Sorry I tried to keep you safe by keeping you away from the reality of what my life entails. Sorry I didn't trust that you're exactly who I've been looking for my entire life, someone who matches my strength with their own, who doesn't flinch from darkness but instead learns to navigate it, who loves me not, despite the violence, but because they understand that sometimes violence is the only language that people like Victor understand. The warehouse is being cleared around us, bodies being removed and evidence being sanitized, and the efficient cleanup operation that apparently follows every mob confrontation going into effect. But we're standing in our own bubble of intimacy and revelation, having a conversation that feels both overdue and perfectly timed given everything that's happened in the past few hours. "Where's Emma?" I ask suddenly, remembering the friend whose kidnapping started this entire chain of events, the woman whose safety I was willing to trade my life for, and Marco's expression shifts into something that might be amusement, or might be exasperation, or might be a combination of both emotions tangled together in the way that seems to characterize most of his reactions to me. Emma was never in danger, he admits, and I feel my stomach drop as the implications of his words sink in, as I realize what he's telling me about tonight's events. The Russos were planning to take her. Luca intercepted their team before they could execute the kidnapping, and we used their own plan against them by feeding you false information about her being taken, knowing you'd do exactly what you did, knowing you'd rush in to save her without thinking about your own safety. And yes, before you get angry, I know this was a terrible thing to do to you, and I know you're going to be furious that we used your love for Emma to set a trap. But it was the only way to draw Victor out. The only way to end this conflict permanently without it dragging on for months and putting you in constant danger. He's watching me carefully, clearly waiting for an explosion of anger or betrayal, clearly expecting me to be furious that he manipulated me into becoming bait for a trap that could have ended with my death if anything had gone wrong. But instead of anger, instead of the betrayal he's expecting, I feel something else entirely. Understanding mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the bone-deep relief that Emma is safe, and this nightmare is finally over, and I can stop looking over my shoulder waiting for the other shoe to drop. You used me as bait, I say slowly, testing out the words, trying to decide how I feel about this revelation. You let me think my best friend was in mortal danger. Let me walk into a warehouse full of hostile Russians who wanted to kill me. Let me face Victor alone, knowing that if your timing was off even slightly, I could have been dead before you arrived, all because you needed to end the Russo threat permanently, and you knew I'd be stupid enough or brave enough or whatever combination of those two things to do exactly what you predicted I'd do. I can see him bracing for my anger, can see him preparing to defend his choice or apologize or do whatever he thinks will make this betrayal forgivable. But I surprise both of us by laughing, by finding genuine humor in the situation, because it's so perfectly emblematic of who we are together. Him making calculated, strategic decisions that involve controlled amounts of danger. Me rushing headlong into those dangers without enough concern for my own well-being. Both of us somehow surviving the chaos we create together. You're not angry, Marco says, and he sounds almost disappointed, like he was prepared for a fight and is confused by my lack of fury. You should be angry, Sarah. You should be screaming at me for using you, for putting you in danger, for manipulating your emotions to serve my strategic purposes. But instead you're laughing like this is somehow funny instead of a massive betrayal of your trust that should probably end with you leaving me and never looking back. His confusion is endearing, in a way that I didn't expect. Makes him seem more human and less like the calculated crime lord who orchestrates complex operations. And I realize that he genuinely doesn't understand why I'm not mad, why his manipulation doesn't feel like betrayal, but rather like the inevitable result of two people trying to protect each other in a world where protection often requires morally questionable methods. I'm not angry because I understand why you did it, because in your position I probably would have done something similar, and because the outcome is that Victor is dead, and his organization is destroyed, and Emma is safe and I'm alive despite making spectacularly poor decisions about trading myself for hostages. I explain, moving closer to him, closing the distance that he's maintaining like he thinks I might change my mind about forgiving him. But Marco, if we're going to make this work, if we're going to build something real together in your world of violence and strategy and calculated risks, then you need to trust me enough to include me in your plans, instead of manipulating me into position. You need to respect that I'm capable of making informed decisions about my own safety, even when those decisions involve danger, and you need to understand that I'm not going anywhere, that you can't scare me away or protect me out of your life, or make me leave by showing me how dark and complicated your world is, because I've already decided that I'm staying, that I'm yours, that I'm choosing this life with you over every safe and reasonable alternative. I take his face in my hands, the way he's done to me so many times, letting him see that I mean every word, that this isn't just post-crisis adrenaline talking, but rather a fundamental truth about who I am and what I want. You're sure? He asks, his voice vulnerable in a way I've rarely heard, his eyes searching mine for doubt or fear or second thoughts. You're sure you want this life, this constant danger, this world where enemies target the people I love, and where violence is always just one bad decision away, where your dreams of medical school might have to be adjusted, or delayed, or completely reimagined to account for the reality of who I am and what I do. His questions are fair, are the kinds of concerns that deserve honest answers, and I take a moment to really consider what I'm agreeing to. What choosing Marco means for my future and my goals and the person I thought I wanted to become, before he crashed into my life covered in wine and attitude, and completely rewrote my expectations for what love could look like. I'm sure, I say finally, with the kind of conviction that comes from having already survived the worst that his world can throw at me, and coming out the other side bruised but unbroken. I'm sure because being with you makes me feel more alive than any plan or goal or carefully constructed future ever has, because you see me as someone strong and capable, instead of someone who needs to be protected from reality, because you challenge me and frustrate me and make me want to be brave enough to match your intensity, and yes, because I love you in ways that probably aren't entirely healthy, but feel absolutely right, despite the chaos and the danger, and the very real possibility that loving you is going to require me to become someone I never imagined being. I pause, gathering my thoughts, trying to articulate something that feels too big for words. Medical school can wait, or I can find ways to make it work within the constraints of your world. Or maybe I'll discover that patching up mob bosses in their offices is its own kind of medical education. But what can't wait is this: us, building something real, with the only person who's ever made me feel like being fearless is an asset instead of a liability. Like my stubborn refusal to back down is something to celebrate instead of something to fix. The kiss that follows is different from the others we've shared. Less about hunger and more about promise. Less about passion and more about commitment. A sealing of something that feels like marriage vows spoken in a warehouse, surrounded by evidence of violence and the aftermath of war. And when we finally pull apart, we're both smiling in a way that suggests we know exactly how insane this all is, and we're choosing it anyway. Choosing each other anyway. Choosing love despite or maybe because of all the reasons it shouldn't work. 6 months later, I'm standing in that same estate library where I once fell asleep studying, but now I'm here by choice rather than exhaustion. Reviewing flashcards for my MCAT retake that's scheduled for next month. Funded by Marco's legitimate investments in ways that neither of us examine too closely, because some questions are better left unasked. I'm back in medical school, finally, pursuing the dream that I thought I'd lost when my mother died. But now I'm doing it as Marco Valentino's partner in every sense of the word. I serve dinner at his business meetings, but now I'm the one giving orders alongside him, Now I'm the one who sits at his right hand and weighs in on decisions that affect the empire we're building together. Now I'm the one who represents strength rather than weakness, who makes his enemies think twice because they know that I'm not a liability to be exploited, but rather another weapon in his arsenal, someone who will fight just as hard and just as dirty when threatened. The sound of glass breaking in the dining room announces the arrival of a new waitress, fresh and nervous, and completely overwhelmed by the weight of serving Chicago's elite. And I watch from the library doorway as she stammers an apology to one of Marco's associates, who's covered in wine and looking murderous. Watch as she backs away with fear written across her face, in ways I remember feeling even though it seems like a lifetime ago now. Marco catches my eye from across the room, and I can see the memory of our first meeting playing across his face. Can see him remembering the girl who refused to apologize, who looked him in the eyes and dared him to do his worst, who changed his entire world by being too stubborn, or too tired, or too reckless to be appropriately afraid. And I move through the dining room with the confidence of someone who belongs here, catching the wine glass before it falls, and smirking as I tell the terrified waitress what I wish someone had told me that first night at Castello Nero. Don't worry, sometimes the best things start with a little mess, and the men in this room might look dangerous, but they're really just drama queens in expensive suits who need someone brave enough to call them on it occasionally. Marco pulls me onto his lap as I pass his chair, a public claiming that would have scandalized me 6 months ago, but now just makes me smile, and I realize that my fearlessness didn't lead me to ruin like everyone predicted it would. Didn't get me killed or destroyed or broken by the violence that surrounds this life, but instead led me to exactly where I was always meant to be, next to a man who matches my strength for strength, my darkness for darkness, my stubborn defiance for stubborn defiance, building an empire together on the foundation of wine stains and death threats, and the kind of love that looks like madness from the outside, but feels like coming home from the inside. They say you should fear the monster, run from the danger, choose safety over passion and reason over recklessness. But I married mine instead, walked directly into the fire everyone warned me about, and discovered that some of us are built to burn, built to thrive in the heat and chaos that would destroy other people, built to love monsters not despite their darkness, but because we recognize that darkness in ourselves and finally found someone brave enough to love us back without asking us to be smaller or safer or more reasonable than we're capable of being. And together we're absolutely unstoppable, fearless in ways that make the world nervous and make our enemies think twice and make every day feel like the beginning of another beautiful disaster that we're going to survive together, because that's what we do. We survive, we adapt, we refuse to break, and we love each other with the kind of intensity that rewrites the rules about what's possible when two people decide that they'd rather burn together than live safely apart.